Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14. We have made it to the middle of the season here in year number 4, as today we're going to go through weeks 7, 8, and 9. So far, this season's been really exciting with a lot of wild results up to this point. It'll be interesting to see if these next few weeks we'll be able to follow up. Last time around, we went through weeks 4, 5, and 6, really kicking off conference play in most major conferences. We had some interesting results. Number 1, Oklahoma squeaked away from Ole Miss in week 4 by just 1. That was certainly a surprise. Some other interesting games included Texas upsetting Alabama, Florida State coming back down by 3 possessions in the fourth quarter to defeat Tennessee, Middle Tennessee State losing in week 4 but coming back down 27 in week 5 to beat Clemson. South Alabama had some impressive wins, including in week 6 against Texas. Some other interesting games here, including Michigan losing their first of the year. Oklahoma also lost their first as well, leading to the Florida State Seminoles taking the new number 1 spot in the AP poll. USC, Cal, Notre Dame, and Virginia Tech are also undefeated in the top 5. Auburn has skyrocketed up the rankings. They are now number 7. And it'll be interesting to see which of these teams at the top kind of fall and which teams, maybe unranked or towards the bottom, are going to potentially make some noise. Maybe some of these Group 5 teams can surprise us. Currently, the Heisman race is pretty wild with Troy Davenport as the favorite, but there's not a lot of certainty with the Heisman race. There are probably 50 different players who could win the award at this point. So we're going to go through weeks 7, 8, and 9, as I said today. Got some very big games, including the Red River rivalry between Oklahoma and Texas. Both teams coming off a loss, could really use a win. LSU, Florida could be interesting. LSU has performed well as of recent. Virginia Tech, UNC, big test for the Hokies with their backup quarterback. Michigan State, Ohio State's a good game. Georgia and Alabama is a must-win game for both teams. I think whoever loses their season might be done. Into week 8, plenty more interesting stuff. You've got Clemson facing off against Navy. That could prove to be an interesting game. Oregon and Iowa could be tough within the Big Ten Conference. Virginia Tech against Miami. USC, Notre Dame, of course, the big one. 2 top 5 teams and 2 big rivals. And then in week 9, Navy facing off against Florida State. Notre Dame, Wisconsin. Oklahoma, Auburn. Are the Tigers for real? I'll be interested to see how they perform. But we'll start here in week 7, and we will open up in Memphis. The Monarchs of Old Dominion face off against the Memphis Tigers. Memphis is currently undefeated this season. They're playing really well in the American Athletic Conference, and they look like they could be a real threat to be the Group 5 team who makes the college football playoff. They've got a pretty tough test today against a talented Old Dominion team, but Memphis really showcased to the world why they could be a team who gets into the playoff. Their quarterback, senior Jari Evans, played quite well in this one, leading Memphis to the win over the Monarchs 41-24. Memphis is definitely going to be a team that you got to keep your eye on over these next few weeks to see if they're still able to perform. They're now ranked as the 20th team in the country with a record of 6-0 after a 3-touchdown game from Jari Evans. As for Old Dominion, they're a talented squad. It would have been nice if their quarterback, Vance Maximum, was healthy the entire game, but unfortunately for them, that was not the case. As we look at Memphis' schedule, I do think it is pretty easy down the stretch. Maybe Boston College could prove to be tough. Florida Atlantic is an interesting team. Army, USF, UConn, all solid, but really nothing that jumps off the page. Next up, we've got the big Red River rivalry. Number 10, Oklahoma has won the Red River rivalry in each of the first 3 seasons of this series. However, 60% of the pick'em vote expects Texas to get the upset. Both teams lost last week and could really use a win here. This game ended up being a classic, a rivalry down to the wire, very exciting. Onyx St. James, the Texas quarterback, showed off his ability with his legs. He's a talented runner. Even though he's not known for his mobility, he can do it. On the other side for Oklahoma, freshman quarterback Salvador Lockwood performed very well. This ridiculous play after the catch by Nasir Kingston was certainly the highlight of the day. Oklahoma's performing with a backup quarterback. Remember, their starter, Deacon Adderley, did get injured, and ultimately the freshman Lockwood would lead them to the win. 43-40, your final. Big win for Oklahoma, who does not move in the poll. They will stay at number 10. As for Texas, Onyx St. James played pretty well, honestly. 5 all-purpose touchdowns, but was unable to get the win. Salvador Lockwood with 3 passing scores. Tyshawn Bankston with 3 rushing touchdowns. Number 18, Oregon's been a little bit disappointing this season. To be fair, their starting quarterback is out for the year. They'll be facing off against number 23, Wisconsin, who has proven to be a tough team so far this year. Oregon is relying on the ground game more than ever, and running back Mason Tartle literally put the team on his back today. Tartle did his best to carry the Oregon Ducks, but Wisconsin made this one a battle until the very end. Ultimately, this game ended up going into overtime after this ridiculous touchdown by the Badgers, and Wisconsin would end up getting the win with a game-winning field goal. The Badgers take it home 41-38, showing that they are a legit team to watch in the Big Ten West, with USC and Notre Dame at the top of that division. Wisconsin made the Big Ten Championship back in Season 1, losing to Michigan. Could they potentially get back there? They're kind of replacing Oregon's spot as that third team in the division. Despite a big game for Mason Tartle, the Ducks are now 3-3 and unranked. LSU is only 2-4, but they are one of the most fun 2-4 teams you'll ever see. They're headed down to Gainesville, the swamp, to face off against number 6, Florida. Going into this game, I expected a battle from the LSU Tigers, and boy, was this a battle. LSU is not your ordinary 2-4 team. They are really fighting for their new first-year head coach. Quarterback Otto Askew, the junior, had another very solid performance. Even though LSU only has 2 wins and not the greatest group of skill position players, Otto Askew's a tough kid. He's a baller. On the flip side, Florida with Deontay Harris gave it everything they got as well. Harris did not have his best game, throwing 4 interceptions, but the rest of the team was able to do well enough to bring the game into overtime, and a game-winning field goal from the Florida Gators would be enough to survive the upset, 45-42. Good win here for Florida at home. They actually drop in the polls from number 6 to number 7 with the 4 interception performance from Harris. As for LSU, again, the record is not great, but don't worry about the record. These guys are playing hard against really good teams. That's really all you can ask for as a first-year head coach. Number 5, Virginia Tech faces off against number 12, the University of North Carolina. The Pick'em seems to be siding with the Hokey Pokeys, who are getting a little bit less than 3/4 of the vote. Virginia Tech is also down to their backup quarterback. Their starter, DeAndre Jones, is currently injured, and it's freshman Jackson Masters making his just second career start against the top 12 team on the road. We ended up witnessing a Jackson Masters masterclass. Masters did not look like a typical freshman. He balled out in this game. Virginia Tech wins 45-35 against the Tar Heels. KJ Whittle had a solid game for UNC, but it was not enough to get the win here at home. Jackson Masters, 28-41, 431 yards and 3 touchdowns, along with a rushing touchdown as well. He was fantastic. Oklahoma State facing off against Missouri, a couple of undefeated teams within the Big 12. We'll see which one of these schools will keep their perfect record. Ultimately, it would be the Cowboys of Oklahoma State. Quarterback Nick Mitchell had a pretty solid game, leading the Cowboys to a strong 34-17 victory over the Missouri Tigers. The Big 12 seems to be a pretty weird conference this year. There's no clear great team this year, so could either of these teams be the ones who make it out of the Big 12 and go to the playoff? This is certainly a good ringing endorsement for Oklahoma State. Missouri, not so much. MJ Combs threw 5 interceptions. Not exactly how you win football games. On the flip side, Nick Mitchell threw for 4 scores and ran for another one in the win. Speaking of the Big 12, here is a rematch of last year's conference championship. The Bearcats of Cincinnati face off against the Baylor Bears, who are ranked 22. Baylor, of course, won the conference championship last year despite being down by 3 scores at halftime, and Cincinnati was out for revenge today. The Bearcats' new starting quarterback, Zachariah Drake, has gotten off to a pretty good start this year, and he kept it going here against the Bears, leading Cincinnati to the win 48-24, pushing Baylor outside of the rankings. Dontavius Brown was stopped for his standards, only 97 yards and 2 touchdowns, which is good for just about anybody else, but not so much for him. As for Cincinnati, it looks like they'll be back at the top of the conference for a second consecutive year with a great game from Drake. Their receivers played well, in specific, Keihane Mehiamalona, who is one of the best receivers in the country. 16 Michigan State heads to the shoe, facing off against number 8, the Ohio State University. After losing in Week 2 to Oklahoma, the Buckeyes have looked pretty much flawless since then, and they would end up keeping things going here against a great Spartans team. Puma Whitlock is reminding everybody why he was not only a Heisman finalist last year, but the college football playoff's most valuable player. Ohio State ran the ball very well too. Ramir Conwell and Mookie Davis both performed very well on the ground as Ohio State wins at 45-26. The Buckeyes did not ask a whole lot out of Puma Whitlock. I think that's the one argument against him for the Heisman Trophy, is that if you put an average quarterback at Ohio State, he'll do just fine. But I don't think that should take away from the season that Puma Whitlock is having. Jay Jordan from Michigan State obviously playing very well too. Georgia heads to Tuscaloosa to face off against the Crimson Tide of Alabama. Both of these teams really need a win, particularly Georgia. The Bulldogs are under 500. They are unranked. And Alabama did not perform well in the last episode either. Which one of these teams will break their slump? Ultimately, it would be the Crimson Tide. Troy Davenport got back to how he performed at the start of the season, leading Alabama to the victory, 38-21. A huge win here for the Crimson Tide. They had to win this game. They could not afford to lose another one as they improved to 4-2. Troy Davenport threw for 5 touchdowns in this one. Overall, a strong performance from him. As for Georgia, the disastrous season gets even worse. Rufus Motley performed horribly again. He ended up getting benched. Good. And the preseason number 1 team is now 2-4 and in serious danger of not even making a bowl game. The final game we're going to cover today is number 21 Texas Tech heading to the booth to face off against the Kansas Jayhawks. Texas Tech is undefeated so far in the American Athletic Conference. They look like another team who could make a run as a Group 5 contender. Texas Tech continued their dominance today. Senior quarterback Yahya Marshall looks like one of the best signal callers in the country. Texas Tech would win this game 52-28. That's probably more points that Texas Tech scored here today than they will the next time they're in Lawrence, Kansas on the hardwood. Rock chalk. Johnny Myers threw for 4 touchdowns here for the Jayhawks, but it was not enough to get the win with a great performance from Yahya Marshall, who one-upped him with 5 touchdowns and nearly 500 yards. We talked about what Memphis has upcoming. Let's take a look at this Texas Tech schedule. They really haven't beaten anybody yet other than maybe Army. Their schedule actually starts to get tough. Later today, they face off against Southern Miss and LSU, the 2 best teams on their schedule so far. After that, it doesn't get much easier with Old Dominion, SMU, UAB, and Rice, all of whom are tough outs. I'm curious to see how Texas Tech can perform here these next few weeks to try to prove if they could be a contender to be the Group 5 representative in the college football playoff. Here's a look at the other results around the country. Miami dropped 63 on Air Force. They are back inside the top 25. Tennessee beats Mississippi State. Washington, USC, Auburn, Notre Dame, Clemson continue to take care of business. And then looking at some of the other scores around the rest of the country. Colorado with a nice win over Stanford. UCF loses to TCU. Good win for the Horned Frogs. Big win for Minnesota over winless Purdue. The Boilermakers are really bad. Central Michigan beats Ohio State in a tight MAC game. Utah upsets Idaho. Good win for the Utes. Texas A&M beats ECU. That's the Aggies' first Fun Belt win of the season. Speaking of the Fun Belt, South Carolina defeats Texas in overtime. Michigan drops 56 on Indiana. So let's take a look at the updated polls. Not a ton of movement at the top. The top 5 stays the same. Auburn and Florida flip at 6 and 7. Washington goes up 5 spots after their blowout against Fresno State. Navy drops a little bit despite winning, with Memphis, Miami, and Oklahoma State now ranked. Oregon, Kentucky, and Baylor drop out. As for the Heisman race, Troy Davenport is still in first, as one would expect after the performance he had. Jet Jackson climbs up to second. Amari August, Levine Adamson, and Harrison Myers wraps up the rest of the list. Players of the week, defensively, Patrick Dukes, a corner for Illinois, and on offense, quarterback Arsene Archambault of the Warhawks from Louisiana Monroe. So that'll bring us into week 8 now. Got plenty more interesting games. I think Idaho and Cal could be a tough battle. I want to see how the Vandals perform in that game. Clemson Navy is going to be a big one. Oklahoma State UCF could be interesting. USC Notre Dame, obviously the biggest one here. Probably the game of the year. 2 top 5 teams in the same conference, in the same division, and huge rivals. Let's start with Idaho and Cal. The Golden Bears have picked up right where they left off for the last 2 seasons. They are undefeated, trying to keep it going here against the Idaho Vandals, who are a pretty tough team. But they did not look all that tough today. Cal looks like an unstoppable machine, and it's because of their run game. Senior running back Harrison Myers not only looks like a legitimate Heisman contender, but he also looks like he could be a first-round pick in this year's draft. Tim Howard's a great compliment as well. Cal wins in dominant fashion, 55-17. Marquise Harris is having another good season just like last year, but they haven't needed him to do a whole lot. This team is about the ground game. As for Idaho, they have fallen off after a nice start. I was hoping to see the Vandals make some noise in the Pac-12, but it doesn't look like it'll happen this year. Clemson heads down to Navy to face off against the midshipmen. The pick'em seems to be riding with the favored Clemson Tigers, getting 2/3 of the vote. The pick'em ended up being hilariously wrong. Navy ran it down their throats. John Dorsey, the senior running back, ended up scoring 3 times as Navy would beat Clemson in dominant fashion, 35-14. Navy's trying to show everybody they're legit. They left a bad taste in my mouth after getting blown out in the ACC Championship last year to Virginia Tech, but they're a good team. As for Clemson, they're now 4-3. Cedric Chapman, 32% completion percentage. I don't think he's ever going to figure it out at this rate, and Clemson does not have a lot of margin for error left. The Oklahoma State Cowboys are undefeated and ranked. They're headed down to Orlando, Mickey Mouse Land, to face off against the Knights of Central Florida, who are one of the better teams in the conference. We got a good look here at junior quarterback Nolan Mitchell II, who has broken out for the UCF offense, and him along with running back Ford Wilder, who scored 4 times, helped the Knights get the upset 38-24 over Oklahoma State. UCF is 5-2. They really could be a contender in this Big 12 conference. Again, with not many clear and obvious good teams in the Big 12. I think either of these teams could really make some noise here. As for Oklahoma State, their stint in the top 25 comes to a quick end. Number 22, Texas, lost last week. The Longhorns have lost 2 in a row. They've got to get back on the win column, facing off against Mississippi State. Texas knew they had to get some things going early, and that they did not. Mississippi State outscored the Longhorns 17-0 in the first quarter, and then after that, things went from bad to worse to really bad. At halftime, the Bulldogs led Texas 38-0. They could have beat them by more if they really want to, but they only won 41-0. Onyx St. James looked like a disaster out there, throwing 4 picks before getting benched. Yeah, I think it's over for the Texas Longhorns, who have now lost 3 in a row. As for Mississippi State, a dominant win for them. Their backup quarterback came in and went 0 for 9. That just goes to show that Mississippi State could have won by more if they really wanted to. Syracuse heads to Middle Tennessee State to face off against the Blue Raiders, who are currently ranked number 13, adjusting to life fairly well in the ACC Conference. Well, things did not go overly well today for the Blue Raiders. Thomas Torminko, the Syracuse quarterback, had a pretty good performance in this late pick 6 from Juan Escala-Salazar, would ultimately lead Syracuse to the upset by the score of 42-28. Juan Escala-Salazar played horribly in this game, 6 of 24, 3 interceptions. He just looked awful. Taquan Pugh was only able to carry the Blue Raiders so far, and Middle Tennessee State dropped out of the top 25 entirely after this game, which I think is a little bit unfair to them. It's not like they lost 41-0, unlike Texas. Virginia Tech's coming off a massive win last week against North Carolina. They're trying to keep things going in the rain as they head down to South Beach to face off against the U, Miami, the Hurricanes, trying to keep the good times rolling after scoring 63 last week against Air Force. Jackson Masters, the freshman Virginia Tech quarterback, had another really good game. Ibrahim Brady, what a catch there in the end zone. But ultimately, it was Miami who was able to overshadow Virginia Tech and get the upset 38-31 with a game-winning drive from quarterback Luke Burnett and a game-winning touchdown to wide receiver Carleek Garlandshire. Big win for Miami. Luke Burnett with probably his best game as a Hurricane. I would not panic if I was Virginia Tech. They're still 5-1. Jackson Masters still played pretty well. He threw for 4 touchdowns, albeit he turned it over twice. But I wouldn't really worry yet if I was them. Number 9, Washington, has flown under the radar, is really good so far this season. They're headed down to Sun Devil Stadium to face off against Arizona State, who is under 500, but they are a pretty talented team. They did not look very talented today as Washington ended up demolishing them 41-14. Washington looks even better than the last 2 seasons. Obviously, Washington has lost to Cal 2 years in a row in the conference championship. Luckily for them, that won't happen again, as both teams are now in the same division, and they're going to play each other, I believe, in Week 11. If both teams remain undefeated, then that could end up being one of the biggest matchups of this season. The Huskies climb up to the 5th spot in the AP poll. That means there are 2 Pac-12 teams in the top 5. How about that? Next up, we're going to head back down to Lawrence, Kansas once again. The Jayhawks facing off against number 10 ranked Oklahoma, who's coming off a nice win last week against Texas. We'll see if the Sooners can carry it over here against their former in-conference rivals, the Kansas Jayhawks. Of course, neither of these teams are in the Big 12 any longer. Kansas would end up shocking the world. Johnny Myers had another good game along with wide receiver Terrell Shakir, and a pick six late from quarterback Utavis Kojemi would propel the Jayhawks to the upset win, 35-31 against Oklahoma. A little rock chalk Jayhawk in here. Big win for Kansas. They're not a horrible team by any stretch. 3-3, 1-1 in conference. Johnny Myers, 3 touchdowns. As for Oklahoma, this is not an in-conference loss, so I wouldn't necessarily panic, but this is certainly not ideal. The Sooners are going to have to win next week in Auburn against the Auburn Tigers, who look really good this season. All right, let's get to the biggest game of the year so far in South Bend, Indiana. Number 2, USC, facing off against number 4, Notre Dame. The pick'em is rolling with USC, gaining 86% of the votes. I think USC has looked more vulnerable this year than Notre Dame. I would have personally picked the Irish to win this game, and I would have ended up being correct, because not only did Notre Dame win this game, but they ended up winning with no problem. They ran it down the USC defense today. Jared Richardson with a big game on the ground. Notre Dame wins in dominant fashion, 44-21. There was just a weird vibe about this USC team. I get they've been winning games, but they've had a lot of close games against suspect teams, and it all came back here today as they get blown out by the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame can legitimately contend for the national title. Their pass game's a lot better than it's been in the past, and obviously they can run the ball really well. I think they could be the team to beat in the Big Ten along with Ohio State. Let's get another look at our friends in Lubbock. The 15th-ranked Texas Tech Red Raiders get their first big test of the season against a talented Southern Miss team. Would Texas Tech end up passing the test? They ended up passing with flying colors. The offense picked up right where they left off from last week. Against Kansas, they scored 52 points. They one-upped themselves here, scoring 55. This looks like the most explosive offense in the country, particularly the passing offense, as they win 55-17. And the Texas Tech Red Raiders are now ranked as the number 10 team in the country. With their 2 wins today, they've climbed up from 22-10. The poll makers are really starting to respect the Red Raiders. I think Texas Tech is not only the team to beat in the American Athletic Conference, but they look like the best Group 5 team in college football right now, and they would be my pick to be the Group 5 representative of the college football playoff. But obviously, we have another half of this season to go. Looking at the other scores, Auburn and Memphis take care of business. Oregon and Michigan are both back in the top 25 with good wins over Iowa and Purdue, respectively. Michigan State with a nice win over Illinois. FIU is ranked as they beat Louisiana Tech. The Golden Panthers now 5-0. Georgia stinks there, 2-5 as they lose to South Carolina. Alabama with a nice win over Arizona. Southern Alabama beats Tulane. And then Florida State remains number 1 as they defeat Rutgers by 35. Taking a look at some of the other scores, Missouri gets back on the win column. They beat BYU. Tulsa gets their first in-conference win of the season over Texas. Nebraska defeats the University of California, Los Angeles. Penn State and Maryland each win their first in-conference games. Duke continuing to suck. Baylor back on the win column. Good win for them. Boise State with a nice win. Bowling Green with a nice win. LSU defeats UMass by 17. Utah, I think, is 4-1. They end up beating Hawaii. And then looking at the bottom here, good win for Northern Illinois over a talented Toledo team. Old Dominion beats UAB. Cincinnati over Kansas State. And that'll just about do it. So we've got more movement here in the top 25 with 2 top 5 teams, USC and Virginia Tech, losing. Notre Dame climbs up to 2. They jump Cal. Auburn makes their way to number 4 as Washington and Texas Tech both go up a lot. Washington all the way up to number 5. Texas Tech all the way up to number 10. I feel like Navy should have gone up more. They only go up 2 after beating a talented Clemson team. Oregon is back at the top 25, along with FIU, Michigan, and South Carolina, while Middle Tennessee State, Iowa, Texas, and Oklahoma State drop out. As for the Heisman Watch, we have a new leader, Jet Jackson, the quarterback out of Auburn. Very interesting here. Jackson's having himself a really good season, and obviously the team is performing quite well, so it'll be interesting to see if he can keep it going. Troy Davenport falls to 2. Callaghan October is now 3rd, with Levine Adamson and Harrison Myers still at 4 and 5. As for your players of the week on defense, it goes to Okore Chibuke, who had 10 tackles for loss against Arizona. That is a lot, along with 3 sacks. He's already probably going to be a first-round pick, but his stock is certainly going up. Then on offense, it goes to Old Dominion wide receiver Silhouette Rodriguez, who caught 19 passes for over 300 yards. Let's take a look at Week 9. Got some interesting games here on the slate. Navy and Florida State. Can the number 1 Seminoles continue their strong start? Notre Dame plays Wisconsin. Oklahoma plays Auburn. I want to see if the Tigers are legit. Michigan with a tough test against Illinois. Texas Tech, LSU. I'm really intrigued by that matchup. Tennessee facing off against Alabama. That's a huge game. Obviously, both teams are rivals and could really use a win. We will start in Blacksburg. For Virginia Tech, Hokie Pokies lost their first game of the season last week. They're trying to get back on the win column as they face off against the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. A couple weeks ago, we got to see a Jackson Masters Masterclass. Today, we got to see a Jackson Masters Disaster Class. Masters ended up throwing 6 interceptions in this game. No, I did not stutter, and you heard me correctly. He threw 6 picks. Despite that, the game was still really close and ultimately ended up going into overtime. On Virginia Tech's first interception of overtime, they were intercepted. Georgia Tech got the ball back. All they needed is a field goal, but they ended up taking the touchdown with a game winner from wide receiver Xavier Apple-Benz. Georgia Tech with the upset here, 34-28, as Virginia Tech loses their second consecutive game after Masters turned the ball over 6 times. Yikes. That's not good at all. Good win here for Georgia Tech. They're now 3-4, getting the upset here over Virginia Tech. Last week I said Virginia Tech shouldn't panic. Now I think they should. This is a total disaster. Number 9, Navy, facing off against Florida State. The pick'em is rolling with the Seminoles, getting 93% of the vote. Well, for the 93% of you who voted for Florida State, congratulations. You played yourself. The Navy midshipman with quarterback Chuck Burton would shock the world here in Tallahassee. Navy defeats the Seminoles 31-23 with a great performance here from Chuck Burton, who's had his ups and downs as the Navy quarterback, but today was certainly his strongest moment. Florida State drops to number 8. To be fair to them, they had to have 3 different quarterbacks play, but, I mean, they still lost. Chuck Burton didn't necessarily dominate. He only completed 50% of his passes for 95 yards. He was solid but not great on the run, but he did well enough to help his team get the win. Navy only jumps up 2 spots. Again, I feel like it should have been more. Number 2, Notre Dame heads to Wisconsin to face off against the Badgers, who've been playing some good football recently. We'll see if Notre Dame can keep things going after their win last week against USC. And if Notre Dame does win, you'd think they'll move up to the number 1 spot in the poll with Florida State losing. This game ended up being quite close. Baz Boyd made some nice plays on the ground for the Notre Dame offense, and that was ultimately able to lead them to the win by the final score of 31-28. The Notre Dame Fighting Irish would move up to the number 1 spot in the poll. Wisconsin actually moved up from 16 to 15. I don't think I've ever seen that before. The team who lost moved up. I guess the AP poll voters thought, hey, they kept it within 3 points against the number 1 team. Why not give them a little scoot up? I don't agree with that ruling, but whatever. It is what it is. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Florida International Golden Panthers. We saw them earlier in the season when they upset Miami. The Golden Panthers are currently undefeated as they head to the Georgia Dome. A sellout crowd. That seems surprising for Georgia State, but we will roll with it. The sellout crowd ultimately saw their Georgia State Panthers lose by 29 points. Let me introduce you to the name Jimmy Jenkins. The FIU senior quarterback is rising up draft boards with his performances throughout really this entire season. The Golden Panthers are now 6-0, still undefeated, ranked as the number 14th team in the country. Could they be the Group 5 representative of the college football playoff rather than one of the schools from the bigger conferences? If FIU goes undefeated, I think there would be a hard time leaving them out. Jimmy Jenkins, 23 for 34, 268 yards and 2 touchdowns. Ryan Whippy on the ground also ran for 2 scores. 22, Oklahoma heads to Jordan-Hare Stadium to face off against number 4, Auburn. The pick'em seems to be rolling with Auburn. Keep in mind, Oklahoma was favored when they were number 10 and 5-1. I think Auburn would be favored now. But it seems like the pick'em guessers kind of figured out that Auburn would be the better team going into this game, and ultimately they ended up being correct. The Tigers really proved themselves here to me today. I wanted to see them perform well against a really good team like Oklahoma, and that they did. Auburn would get the win by the score of 38-28, and the Tigers are in the clear driver's seat in the SEC West division. The SEC West has been a complete disaster this season. The only team within 2 games of Auburn right now is Oklahoma, and Auburn has the tiebreaker over Oklahoma, who is still ranked despite losing. Number 14, Memphis, heads to Boston College to face off against the Eagles. This is Boston College's first year in the American Athletic Conference, and I guess they have been better than they were previously in the ACC. This game ended up being an offensive dogfight. Memphis certainly looks like a team who could make the college football playoff, at least offensively. They scored 49 points. Boston College also scored 49 points in regulation, ultimately bringing the game into overtime. Ultimately, the Eagles would get the upset win with a game-winning field goal, 52-49. Big win here for Boston College. They're now 4-4, 3-2 in conference. As for Memphis, I wouldn't worry too much. They are still the favorite in their division, but this does give them less margin for error now having a conference loss. So they're going to have to be on their A game the rest of the year. I think the Michigan Wolverines have been probably the most underrated team in the country this season. They've only lost 1 game. I feel like they're being disrespected in the rankings. It's just because the team had a disappointing season last year, but they look like they are back. Today, they kept it going here in Champaign, Illinois. Callaghan October, the sophomore quarterback, looks like a legitimate contender for the Heisman Trophy, leading Michigan to the win 52-30. Right now, there are not 10 teams better than Michigan in the country. I'm sorry. The Wolverines are back. They made the college football playoff in each of the first 2 seasons of the series. And again, they were not good last year, but Michigan is back. They're ranked at 18. I think that is ridiculously disrespectful, but they'll get plenty of chances to improve that ranking as early as next week when they face off against their rivals, Michigan State. That's going to prove to be a really big game for them. Illinois is a tough team. This was not an easy win for Michigan on the road. Illinois falls to 3-4. Doesn't look like the Fighting Illini are going to have as good of a season as they did a year ago. This game I'm really intrigued by. Texas Tech, who's number 10, who's undefeated, whose offense is rolling, facing off against LSU. Yes, the Tigers are 3-5, but as I've noticed all year, this is a tough, gritty football team, and they will not make your life easy. I was expecting a really competitive game, and it absolutely was. Through the first 3 quarters, this game was knotted up at 35. Texas Tech started off really hot, but LSU responded with another really good game from junior quarterback Otto Askew. So with this game being tied at 35, going into the 4th quarter, which team would really take control? That would end up being the Red Raiders of Texas Tech. They outscored LSU 21-0 in the 4th quarter to win this game 56-35. Texas Tech scored at least 50 points in all 3 games today as they passed their next test again in flying colors. The Red Raiders are 8-0, 4-0 in conference, and they are now number 6 in the polls. Texas Tech controls their own fate. Again, they have a tough schedule, but if they win out, they're going to the college football playoff. They've got 5 more games to do it. Tennessee heads to Tuscaloosa to face off against the University of Alabama. The Crimson Tide are ranked number 12, playing a lot better today than they did in the last episode. Tennessee, meanwhile, ranked number 15. Both of these teams have 2 losses at the moment and would not like to take a third. This game ended up being really close. Obviously, big-time rivals. You know they're going to play each other well, and the stakes are really big. Both of these teams cannot afford to go down any further within their conference races. Tennessee would end up getting the win here on the road by just 1. 33-32, your final. Tennessee moves up to number 11, while the Crimson Tide dropped to 16. They are now 2-3 in conference. So again, Auburn's lead continues to grow in the SEC West. As for the SEC East, with Georgia struggling, that division feels like it's up in the air. Florida looks like the favorite right now, but could a team like Tennessee potentially run the table, beat Florida, and get that spot? It is certainly possible. The Clemson Tigers have been a little bit disappointing this season. They've lost 3 games. They just haven't looked like themselves, with quarterback Cedric Chapman not taking the leap that everybody would have expected him to. They are facing off against the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, who haven't been great, but they are a lot better than they were last year. Clemson had to come in here at home and remind everybody who they really are. The Tigers dominated in this game, winning 34-3. I still don't know if I can confidently say that Clemson is a contender for the national championship. They pretty much need to win out if they want to make the college football playoff, but It is certainly possible. They're ranked back at number 13 in the country, which I think is a little bit generous. There's no way a team like this should be lower than, say, Michigan. I think that's crazy, but whatever. Connie Goodson Jr., 9 catches, 234 yards, and a touchdown. Connie Goodson Jr. has been the Clemson offense this year. His stock is rising fast. As for the final game today, we've got some Fun Belt action. Number 25, South Carolina, looks like the team to beat in the conference. They're facing off against the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Wake Forest ran the ball really well in this game, and they were ultimately able to beat South Carolina 35-32. The big story of this game was South Carolina's quarterback, Malachi Evans, being suspended for the first half due to a violation in his NIL contract. If Evans had been able to play the whole game, could South Carolina have won? Certainly possible. The Gamecocks are now 6-3. They've lost 2 games in conference. Remember, there's only one guaranteed Group 5 team to make the playoffs, and with how Memphis, Texas Tech, and FIU are looking, it's not looking good for South Alabama or anybody in the Fun Belt to get into this year's college football playoff. Let's take a peek at some of the other scores around the rest of the country. Michigan State with a nice win over Purdue. Really excited about the game next week between them and Michigan State. Ohio State, Washington, Bowling Green, USC. They take care of business. UNC upset by Syracuse. Middle Tennessee State is back ranked. Florida, Cal, others, again, taking care of business. UCF with a good win over San Diego State. Central Michigan beats Akron, 2 of the better teams in the MAC. South Alabama back unranked as they lose to the University of Louisiana Lafayette. Middle Tennessee State's win, I forgot to mention, it was against Duke, a rematch of last year's college football playoff classic. UAB defeats Southern Miss. Oregon beats UCLA. Arizona State over Stanford. That's a surprise. Stanford looks like the favorite in their division. Cincinnati's still undefeated in conference play as they beat Missouri. Texas loses their 4th in a row, falling to TCU. Baylor beats Air Force, and that's pretty much it. So we've got a lot of movement here in the polls. Number 1, Florida State lost, so Notre Dame is the new top dog. Cal, Auburn, and Washington are in the top 4. They're all getting first place votes. The Texas Tech Red Raiders, the star of today's episode, they move up to number 6. They are also getting a first place vote. Middle Tennessee State makes their way back into the rankings as they are now number 20. Kentucky and Bowling Green join them. It's about time Bowling Green gets ranked. They've been playing really well again this year. As for the Heisman Watch, we have a new leader again. It's Callaghan October, the quarterback out of Michigan. He has taken a massive leap and looks like one of the top quarterback prospects, period, in the country, despite just being a sophomore. Jackson and Davenport move down a spot. Harrison Myers and Amari August climb up the list. As for your players of the week, on defense, Jelani Johnson Jr. of Northwestern, and on offense, Texas Tech quarterback Yahya Marshall. I feel like Marshall should be getting some more love in the Heisman race, but that's just me. Let's take a look at weeks 10 through 12 in the next episode. We're going to continue to get down to the nitty-gritty in some of these big conference races. We found out a lot today, and we're going to find out plenty more. Ohio Bowling Green could be pretty interesting, as could Washington and Idaho. Michigan State, I'm really excited about. Miami, Florida State could be interesting. How will the Seminoles respond? In week 11, another Game of the Year candidate, Washington and California. We've also got Notre Dame, Oregon, Middle Tennessee State, Virginia Tech. And then we've got plenty more interesting games here in Week 12 as well. We're going to really dive deep into these conference races in the next episode. Take a look at which teams are in line to make their conference championships and who will be positioning themselves well to make the college football playoff. That'll wrap up today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.